focus of my presentation today, I'm going to do something a little bit different, and hopefully that'll help us to keep awake for the next 20 or so minutes. I want to come back a little bit, and this is a topic that I spoke about a few years ago, and I think we're in a good space to talk about it again, and that's actually the people element and more importantly, the culture element. To be able to embrace a digital culture is a lot more than just the tech, and I think that the maturity of how we're talking about the tech, where we're looking at the technology applications, has dramatically improved over the last couple of years, but I think it's a useful checkpoint to let's just take a step back and think a little bit about the culture aspect of it. And it works. So looking from the outside, I mean, in the industry, of course, we're sort of looking at the fact there's so much happening. We're unleashing data. We're liberating collaborations across different spectrums. But spare a thought for the people who are still in other industries and looking outside in. And from their perspective, the question still arises, is the maritime industry still traditional? How much has really changed? And I always find that interesting. I asked the organizers if I could walk around, and I'm going to do that just for two reasons. One, I'm going to test the cameraman's agility, and two, I think it's a little bit more interesting if I'm moving and the slides are moving. And what's been very clear, and particularly in the last year, is exactly how crucial the maritime industry actually is. And congratulations to BIMCO on their recent video, and also MPA on their efforts to sort of translate what the shipping industry does to everybody and everyday things. I mentioned in a question earlier in the panel, this is an industry driven by regulations, and we're used to taking a reactive stance, and I truly believe that we're on the cusp of this shifting. And if innovation is going to trigger regulation, have we been able to create that environment, that discussion, and that sense of responsibility to actually take that on? We automatically say we need to work with class. Of course we do. But who else? What else? At what point are we ready to actually do a physical pilot? And at what point does that pilot become wider? Do we need to wait for the regulation to come in to guide before it becomes a standard solution? I think the other element that I want to bring on is about this concept about looking outside the industry for tech competencies that we can adopt, and I think it's fair to say that we're on that traction path. So what changed then? I mean, how suddenly has this industry, from our perspective at least, how has it suddenly become ready for this 4.0? What happened? The data generation part was never a problem. I mean, we always had tons of data. Of course, it's all localized and siloed, and a big part of the discussion is about, you know, how do we open that up? Accessing computing power was something that the industry was never going to develop themselves or responsible for, and I think that's a consequence of what happens in other locations. But communication, and I suppose no coincidence, I'm sitting on the Inmarsat table. Communication has been a massive change. The only challenge, though, the only thinking that I want to throw out there is there's such an immense focus on data ownership. Data is the new oil. So let me throw out there that if data is the new oil, is it actually the crude oil that is the most important? Or is it the refining capability and the refined products that are most important? Is it actually the raw data ownership that is the most important? Or is it who gets access, who gives access that is most important? Has the time come now for us to actually use that oil analogy to take one step further and really think about actually access and what we do with that access as opposed to ownership alone? Because as communication capabilities increase, and you know, why is this a big deal? Because while the rest of the world was already enjoying the fruits of 3G and 4G, ships, largely speaking, were still sitting in the 1G, 2G space. And of course, as they evolve and start to get exactly what the benefits, let's say the shore side got in the late 90s, early 2000s, and if you think back about what 3G actually enabled, the starting point of the Facebooks of the world, the starting point I guess, of the Amazons of the world and so on and so forth. You then have that enablement on a vessel level. What could it unleash? But it comes back to, it's the connections, it's the refining capability, and it's the actual output of that refinement. In data terms, it's actually the knowledge and insight which is going to be most valuable, not the raw data itself. And as an industry, we're going to lose out if we're going to, for too much longer, continue to get focused on the ownership rather than the access. So my perspective is, trade the access to benefit from the insight rather than ring fence the ownership, because nobody benefits. From our own perspective, and I guess, you know, coming back to the culture part, and it links to the mindset part, from our own perspective in Wilhelmsen, we adopted an open innovation framework, and we adopted it in such a way that we actually called the function open innovation. And this was because we recognized that it was impossible for us to take these solutions forward. It was impossible for us to develop solutions on our own. Quite honestly, it was almost getting impossible for us to know the true extent of pain points alone as well. And so open innovation was really a recognition that we needed to challenge the permeable boundaries of our organization, working with regulatory bodies, other suppliers, port authorities, partners, et cetera, to develop these wide ecosystems. And that's constantly evolving. And I think earlier we saw the presentation from Kenneth, which very much appreciative of, some of the initiatives that we have, whether it's in the 3D printing space, whether it was in the drone space previously, or indeed in the next few weeks, you're going to hear some more announcements of some phenomenal developments. It's all based on an ecosystem approach. And that ecosystem approach and what is in the ecosystem and who benefits and who doesn't and so on and so forth is about recognizing that it isn't just the people who transact with each other. And that's kind of important, and I'll come back to that point. So in order to be able to move that forward, I guess, you know, it comes back to, and you'll notice, nothing to do with the tech still. In order to take that forward, it's about coming back to this mindset shift from a scenario of scarcity to a scenario of abundance. And this is a huge shift. And what do I mean by that? So rather than individual organizations or individual companies looking to just purely capture value from competitors, customers, and suppliers, meaning a winner-takes-all approach, it's about making that pie bigger, more abundant, such that there is a co-creation of value with the benefit for everybody. And I can see the naysayers, and of course I can see the people who are thinking, what, this guy's crazy. I've got to be able to beat my competition in order to survive. The challenge that we're having is if the barriers to enter in parts of our industry are so low, the very people who we consider as competition today are not going to be those people who are competitors tomorrow. They're going to come from somewhere else. So this is a really important fundamental mindset shift. And there's a very practical example of how we go forward pivoting in our 3D printing ecosystem, for example, how we try to bring together benefit in totality. Super happy to talk more in detail about this, and I know I've got Håkon in the audience as well, who's in charge of our 3D printing venture, and we've got other examples as well. Mindset shift number 2. People in our own teams, people need to be directed and managed, otherwise there will be absolute chaos. If you don't instruct in detail what has to happen, nothing will get done. Whereas in actual fact, if you get the responsibility and authority, and this is an experience from our own teams, people will be highly engaged, teams will start to be much more self-managing, and will figure out ingenious solutions and will deliver exceptional results, and that we've seen with our own examples. And when we think about remote operation, when we think about the challenges that COVID brought about, this hierarchical directive approach to innovation is unlikely going to be sustainable. Third mindset shift. To deliver the right outcome, the most senior and experienced individuals must define where we're going, have the detailed plans, and minimize risk along the way. that's basically how we operate, right? I mean, you know, we got to say from top down what's happening, what do we do, what do we don't do, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is, and this is something I'd written about in an article actually in one of the maritime academies, we're sitting in this constantly evolving environment. None of us in the room can claim to know exactly what that solution is. And therefore, what direction can we be expected to give? And when we ask, for example, the regulators to say, all right, make the rules so that I know exactly how I want to operate. And now obviously there are areas where they have to do this, but there are also just as much areas where embracing that uncertainty, and that's part of taking the responsibility of iteration, pushing forward, working with the regulators quite early on in safe spaces, sandboxes, to start to bring some of those solutions so that actually the regulations can be crafted to take care of exactly what you're trying to disrupt or what you're trying to solve. And finally, this one, and this is my most favorite one, is because, of course, this is an obvious one, right? Everybody talks about this. It's the technology as an enabler. But to try to move away from technology being a supporting capability to actually technology being seamlessly integrated in every part of the organization, and that also means every part of your solutioning, every part of the initiative, and so on and so forth, is a massive change in approach. What that also means is that it isn't one department, it isn't the IT department that hires the data scientists, that hires the new age skills. It isn't another department that hires DevOps capabilities. It's actually the business operating teams that you're embedding these skill sets in. And again, skeptical, right? That doesn't make any sense. I've got to be able to synergize and concentrate and create efficiency so that I can share across the teams. But this is exactly my point, where I think this is a mindset shift such that we don't end up in a situation where, from our own experience, we end up disconnecting the guys with the domain expertise at middle management level, operational levels, being suspicious about what the tech competence teams are coming up with, such that in their mind this is about getting rid of me or my capability, but actually making that shift to actually these solutions that we're coming up with is really to help us. And I see this actually very often. This is probably the biggest adoption hurdle that exists in the industry as such. Why should I use this if it's ultimately not going to help me, but more importantly, if it's ultimately going to get rid of me? From our own perspective, I mean, we're sort of transitioning to the digital age with a number of initiatives. I think several of these you've probably heard about. One of the biggest learnings that we had, or let me take to the next slide, several learnings, but one of the biggest learnings that we had is that innovation is not equal to invention. So it isn't actually about building or inventing or creating from scratch. Innovation was so much, we achieved so much more and continue to achieve so much more by connecting the dots and being brave enough and having that mindset that it was absolutely okay to connect dots with other stakeholders in the industry rather than trying to compete and recreate just so that there was a control domain. The other a couple of points that I want to bring up, and I think this could be useful in some of the solutions, disrupting the supply chain, which is what a lot of the solutions that we talk about today and in general, it really requires a highly scalable adoption channel. And that's what the ecosystems are about. But most importantly, there's a requirement to bridge a trust deficit. And that trust deficit is about, what am I sharing with you? What am I getting back in return? Is this really for the benefit of everything, or is this just about you selling me a solution? And how you bridge that trust deficit is really, really critical. And that colors or influences who else and what else do you need in your circles of innovation or in your ecosystems. We talked about these digital natives being part of the new generation of seafarers and also in the offices. And the consequence of that is, of course, that the B2C experiences that we have in our personal lives influence B2B users in their interface expectations, but not to get confused that the B2B solutions will not have the same success metrics as the B2C solutions. You will not have 100 million users. your valuations will not be based on 50 times revenue and so on and so forth, but at least understanding that the user experience needs to be similar, but actually what is required to be delivered in the B2B space is it comes back down to this connection of the pain points and so on and so forth. Shipping has unique challenges, there's no doubt about it, but I think there's no argument, and there never should, that decision making augmented with data is always a good idea. That's a no-brainer, right? But then it comes back to valuing ownership versus access, because you cannot individually own all of the data that is required to augment the decision making that is required to truly make a difference. Something around architectures, and we talk a lot about, again, the technology piece, the cloud-based solution architecture, but actually from a cultural perspective, what that is all about is just connecting cross-functional competencies. It's an enabler, it's a conduit to actually connect shore-based competence, supplier competence, customer competence, and your vessel competence together. So I think this whole context, and especially for the technologists in the room, cloud architecture is an enabler for something else. Scale paths, and this was a painful experience for us, but we learned it really quick. It requires external partnerships, and I think this comes back to the open innovation piece. So when you're thinking about the solutions and you're thinking about what is the number that is required to be able to adopt, I think, Peter, you mentioned 4,000 vessels. In my own head, a chasm of adoption is about 2,000 ships, 3, 4, whatever is the number. It doesn't matter. But the point here is, how do you get to that number? How can you get to that number faster? What are the barriers that need to be lowered? And thinking about the channels of adoption, super, super important. And that doesn't come naturally to us, because this is part of the mindset shifts that I talked about earlier. Håkon mentioned during the panel our 3 questions, and I want to share that again, because all of this stuff around the pain points and around the mindset shifts and so on and so forth boils back down to these 3 questions, and these were the foundations for our own venture pathway. Is there demand in what we're doing? Is there value in what we're doing? And can we do it? And I think the point here is that the can we do it part, which is the tech part, has never been the challenge. Has never been the challenge. So it's really the people part. And you know, shipping, this is the interesting thing. Shipping comes from a background. Shipping comes from a tradition of training and preparedness and competence, which is the foundations of what this industry is on. And it's exactly those very reasons that should allow us to be prepared to actually go into these scale paths and adoption. And as I said, this is a presentation I did a few years ago, but I'm coming back to this because we've matured over the last 2 years on what do pilots look like, how do we get pilots, how does that happen? We need to talk about scale paths. If we don't have clear scale paths to that minimum adoption level that you're talking about, these solutions aren't going to come to anything. And those scale paths, the bridging and the bottlenecks are all about the people. Every person plays a part, and what do I mean by every person plays a part? It's exactly those people's, the middle section, the domain experts who are most suspicious about new solutions, who are the ones that can benefit the most, but more importantly, can provide the most value to solutioning. So as a company, we've spent a lot of time in crossing this trust deficit with the people that we need from a domain perspective to connect to the technologists. I mean, one of the worst things that we saw is you bring a bunch of technologists, you know, I like to say this several times, 3 data scientists, 2 programmers, and a CDO is not the solution to all your problems. What it really is the solution to your problems is when you connect exactly that team with your domain experts. But what tends to happen is there's a conflict, it doesn't work, so you take this team, put it a little bit further away and a little bit further away, then put them in the corner somewhere so that they can continue to work on the new stuff, because the people who understand ship operations are really coming in the way. That's a sure shot trigger for failure. Because the very people you need to adopt the solutions are the ones that you're distancing already early on. And so the amount of time and energy you spend very early on to connect that domain piece is well worth it later from an adoption perspective. And it's not just the skill sets, it really is the mindsets. It is this mindset of not winner takes all, really, but it's about collaboration. It's not about, and you know, fantastic, right? All of us did Strategy 101 in business school, where you learn about Michael Porter's value chain. Michael Porter's value chain doesn't work for the environment that we're in. It's much more about value networks. There's a lot of parallel things that are taking place today. And let's go take that one step further. Porter's 5 forces, where you have competitors on one side, suppliers on the other, customers on one side, and you know, whoever else on the other, that works in a static environment. But going forward, your suppliers will become your customers. Your customers will become your competitors. And your competitors will become your suppliers. That's what I mean by this mindset shift. Because exactly the people you want to win against are more than likely going to be exactly the people you need to end up collaborating with to actually win in the game. I'm going to end with this so that we have some time for Q&A. Like I said, it's a bit of a shift. It's not about tech. We have a lot of solutions. It gets a lot of attention, which I'm super grateful for. Really pleased with the adoption method. But I think it's just a reminder. It's a step back. That as we now mature and get into the details of implementation, it's the scale paths that are most important. It's recognizing that a digital future isn't just about the technology. It's the organizational culture, it's the digital culture, it's the adoption culture. You're going to want to now start to connect people who come from very different backgrounds. You're going to want to connect people, some who say, we have dramatically developed over the last 10 years, and some who look at the 2 mooring photographs and say, what's changed in this industry for 40 years, 50, 100? And with that I end, hopefully with some pause for reflection, and very happy to take questions.
Are there any questions from the floor? Tim. There we are. Question for Nakul. Do we, somewhat ironically, need fewer shipping people in shipping? Is it easier to find people with no experience of secretive shipping traditions than to make the mindset shift?
That's a great question, because it comes to the core of exactly what I was trying to mention. Let me put it this way. Do we need more people from outside shipping to come into shipping? Yes. Do we need less people who are in shipping to stay in shipping? No. It's about that domain expertise, right? If you don't connect the two, that's a failing. And whilst new age thinking, challenging fundamental assumptions, challenging holy grails is a big part of disruptive development, similarly, understanding the complexity of a truly global industry, understanding the complexity of an industry that is grappling with heavy regulation on the one end and lack of insight and understanding and, dare I say it, regulation on another end. And so this bridging is what is really important. I think what I will say, though, is that we need, and I think in the most ironic sense, 2020 was a great opportunity. It uncovered, to a large degree, this veil of secrecy that shipping has. And one of the reasons that I commended the videos that I did earlier on in my presentation is because more and more people, common people on an everyday basis, recognize the role that ships play. So I think the point here is we definitely need shipping people to be involved and understand. What we don't need is for shipping people who refuse to adopt, who refuse to adapt, and believe that shipping of the 90s will be the shipping of the 2090s. I think that probably best explains it.